Number 1, Betty Broderick, a marriage planned for murder. Elizabeth Ann Broderick, known to the world as Betty, was a woman who seemingly had it all in the early 1970s, living the quintessential American dream in San Diego, California, before a cascading series of betrayals transformed her life into a cautionary tale of rage, jealousy, and ultimate devastation. Betty met Daniel T. Broderick III, a handsome and ambitious medical student, and the two married in 1969, quickly embarking on a life that mirrored the upward mobility of the era. Dan was brilliant, driven, and fiercely focused on his career, eventually leaving medicine to pursue law, where he excelled spectacularly. He passed the California bar exam on his first attempt and joined a prestigious law firm, eventually becoming one of the most successful malpractice attorneys in San Diego. Betty, in turn, played the role of the perfect corporate wife, supporting him through his grueling years of education, raising their 4 children, Lee, Kim, Daniel, and Rhett, managing their upscale household, and cultivating the social connections that Dan needed to climb the professional ladder. For nearly 2 decades, their life appeared flawless from the outside, a picture of suburban prosperity and marital stability, but beneath the polished surface, a deep reservoir of resentment was quietly and steadily filling. Dan was notoriously demanding and emotionally unavailable, treating Betty less like a partner and more like an employee whose sole purpose was to facilitate his success. Betty endured this dynamic for years, suppressing her own ambitions and desires, until the fissures in the marriage became too large to ignore. The breaking point arrived in 1983 when Dan, then 44 years old, met Linda Kolkina, a 21-year-old receptionist and legal assistant at his law firm. Linda was young, beautiful, blonde, and attentive, everything that Betty, after years of childbearing and domestic labor, felt she no longer was. What began as an extramarital affair quickly escalated into an open secret within the legal community, and Dan made little effort to hide his infidelity. He began staying out late, taking trips with Linda, and openly flaunting the relationship, subjecting Betty to profound public humiliation. When Betty finally confronted him, Dan was cold and unapologetic, essentially telling her that he was in love with Linda and wanted to end the marriage. The divorce proceedings that followed were among the most contentious and brutal in San Diego history, dragging on for 4 years and costing hundreds of thousands of dollars in legal fees. Dan, leveraging his intimate knowledge of family law and his vast financial resources, systematically dismantled Betty's life. He moved out of the family home, froze her access to funds, and used a series of legal maneuvers to gain custody of their children, eventually being awarded sole physical custody while Betty was relegated to limited, supervised visitation. The family home was sold, and the proceeds were consumed by legal costs, leaving Betty financially devastated and emotionally shattered. She was forced to move into a much smaller house in a less affluent neighborhood, a stark and daily reminder of everything she had lost. Throughout the ordeal, Betty's behavior became increasingly erratic and volatile. She began leaving profane, rambling voicemails for Dan and Linda, driving by their house in the middle of the night, and publicly accosting them at social events. She even drove her car through the front door of Dan's new house, an act of vandalism that resulted in her arrest but did little to alter the custody arrangement. Her friends and family watched helplessly as the woman they knew transformed into someone consumed entirely by hatred and a desire for retribution. Dan, for his part, seemed almost amused by her outbursts, using them in court to portray her as an unfit, unstable mother, which only further reinforced the cycle of her rage and powerlessness. On November 5, 1989, the situation reached its horrific and irreversible conclusion. Betty had been spiraling for months, her mental state deteriorating under the weight of her perceived injustices, and she had come to believe, with a terrifying conviction, that the only way to escape her torment was to eliminate its source. In the early morning hours, she took a key she had obtained, whether through stealth or from one of her children remains a point of contention, and let herself into the home that Dan shared with Linda, who was now his wife, having married him in a lavish ceremony just months earlier. The house was dark and quiet. Betty crept through the hallway, clutching a 5-shot Smith & Wesson revolver that she had purchased weeks earlier. She entered the master bedroom, where Dan and Linda were asleep in their bed. What happened next was brief but catastrophic. Betty fired the weapon multiple times, striking both Dan and Linda. Linda was hit in the head and died almost instantly, while Dan was struck in the chest and torso. He survived the initial volley and reportedly made it to the hallway before collapsing and dying from his wounds. After the shooting, Betty did not attempt to flee. She left the house, drove to a friend's home, and calmly confessed to what she had done. When police arrived at the murder scene, they found the bedroom in disarray, the bodies of Dan and Linda lying in pools of blood, and the gun discarded nearby. Betty was arrested without incident and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, to which she pleaded not guilty, claiming that she had only intended to confront Dan and that the shooting was not premeditated but rather the result of a sudden, overwhelming emotional break. The trial of Betty Broderick captivated the nation, dividing public opinion along sharp gender lines and sparking intense debates about the justice system's treatment of women in volatile divorces. Prosecutors painted a portrait of a cold, calculating woman who had meticulously planned the murder, pointing to the gun purchase, the means of entering the house, and the sheer brutality of the act itself. They argued that her jealousy and sense of entitlement had curdled into a murderous rage that she had willingly and deliberately acted upon. The defense, led by high-profile attorney Jack Early, argued that Betty was a victim of severe emotional abuse at the hands of a powerful man who had systematically destroyed her life, her identity, and her relationship with her children. They contended that she was suffering from clinical depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, and that on the night of the murders, she was in a dissociative state, not fully in control of her actions. The jury, after days of deliberation, rejected the defense's argument that Betty lacked the capacity for premeditation, finding her guilty of 2 counts of second-degree murder in 1991, a verdict that carried a sentence of 32 years to life in prison. The judge, acknowledging the tumultuous history of the case but emphasizing the gravity of taking 2 lives, handed down the maximum sentence allowable under the law. Betty was remanded to the California Institution for Women in Chino, where she has remained ever since, becoming something of a cultural icon in the process, the subject of books, television movies, and endless psychological analysis. She has been denied parole multiple times, with boards consistently citing her continued lack of remorse and failure to fully accept responsibility for the murders. The case of Betty Broderick stands as a harrowing example of how the dissolution of a marriage, when compounded by betrayal, legal warfare, and systemic power imbalances, can drive a human being to commit acts of unimaginable violence, leaving a wake of devastation that extended far beyond the 2 victims to their orphan children, their extended families, and a community forced to reckon with the terrifying capacity of jealousy to destroy everything in its path. Number 2, Clara Harris, a fatal collision born from betrayal. Clara Suarez Harris was a 44-year-old successful dentist in Houston, Texas, a woman who had built a thriving practice and a reputation for competence and dedication, embodying the modern archetype of the professional wife and mother who seemed to have balanced the demands of career and family with remarkable grace. She had met David Lynn Harris, an orthodontist, in the early 1990s, and the two had married in 1992, forming what appeared to be a power couple within the Houston dental community. Together, they had 3 sons and shared a life of considerable affluence, residing in a luxurious home in the affluent Clear Lake area near the Johnson Space Center. Clara had invested heavily in the marriage, not only emotionally but financially, having used her own savings to help David establish his orthodontic practice, a generosity she would later come to deeply regret as the foundation of their life together began to crack. The troubles in their marriage began to surface in the early 2000s when David, then in his mid-40s, embarked on an affair with Gail Bridges, a former receptionist who had worked in his office. The affair was a profound betrayal on multiple levels, not only because it violated the sanctity of their marriage but because it involved a woman whom Clara had essentially helped employ. When Clara discovered the infidelity, the revelation shattered her sense of security and unleashed a torrent of jealousy and insecurity that would progressively consume her over the following months. David initially promised to end the relationship and even attended marriage counseling sessions with Clara, but his promises were hollow, and he continued to see Gail in secret. Clara, consumed by suspicion and a desperate need to know the truth, resorted to increasingly extreme measures to confirm what she already suspected in her heart. She hired private investigators, installed tracking devices on David's vehicle, and even donned disguises to follow him herself, actions that demonstrated the depths of her emotional unraveling. The private investigators confirmed the affair, providing Clara with photographic evidence of David and Gail together at various locations around Houston, including restaurants, hotels, and shopping centers. When confronted with the evidence, David did not deny it but instead became defiant, telling Clara that he was in love with Gail and wanted a divorce. The news hit Clara with the force of a physical blow, triggering a psychological collapse that her friends and family would later describe as a complete departure from the rational, composed woman they had known. She began losing weight, suffering from insomnia, and experiencing panic attacks, yet she continued to try to save the marriage, pleading with David to reconsider and even suggesting that they engage in an open marriage if that was what he wanted, a desperate and humiliating offer that David rejected. On July 24, 2002, the mounting pressure and festering jealousy reached their catastrophic climax. That evening, Clara and David had attended a birthday party at a hotel near NASA's Johnson Space Center, an event that was meant to be a social outing but instead became the stage for the final, fatal act of their disintegrating relationship. Earlier in the day, Clara's private investigator had informed her that David and Gail were planning to meet at the same hotel that evening, a revelation that sent Clara into a state of acute emotional distress. She drove to the hotel with her twin stepdaughter, Lindsay Harris, who was David's daughter from a previous marriage and who had unwittingly become a passenger in the unfolding tragedy. Upon arriving at the hotel, Clara spotted David and Gail in the lobby, and what followed was a chaotic and agonizing public confrontation. Clara approached the couple, screaming accusations and demanding that David leave with her. David, embarrassed and angry, attempted to deflect her and eventually walked away from the lobby with Gail, heading toward the parking garage. Clara, followed by Lindsay, pursued them through the hotel and out into the night. In the parking lot, the situation escalated further as Clara continued to scream and cry, her emotions entirely unregulated and overflowing. David got into his vehicle, a black Mercedes-Benz, and Gail got into her car, preparing to leave. Clara ran to her own vehicle, a silver Mercedes-Benz SUV, and positioned it behind David's car in the narrow parking garage aisle. What happened in the next few minutes has been the subject of intense scrutiny, legal debate, and chilling forensic reconstruction. Witnesses in the parking garage reported hearing screeching tires and a loud impact. According to testimony and evidence presented at trial, Clara accelerated her SUV and rammed it into the back of David's Mercedes, pushing it forward. David, who had stepped out of his vehicle during the confrontation, attempted to flee on foot, but Clara put the SUV in reverse, backed up, and then accelerated forward again, striking David with the vehicle and pinning him against a concrete wall. The impact was severe, causing massive internal injuries from which David Harris died at the scene. Lindsay, who was in the passenger seat of Clara's SUV, screamed for her to stop, later testifying that she had grabbed the steering wheel in a futile attempt to prevent the collision. After the vehicle came to a rest, Clara sat in the driver's seat in a state of apparent shock, and when police arrived moments later, she was detained and taken into custody. The investigation into David Harris's death was led by the Houston Police Department, with homicide detectives and crime scene investigators meticulously documenting the parking garage, the positions of the vehicles, the blood spatter patterns, and the physical damage to both cars. Forensic experts from the Harris County Medical Examiner's Office conducted an autopsy that revealed David had suffered multiple blunt force injuries consistent with being struck by a vehicle and pinned against a solid structure. The evidence strongly contradicted Clara's initial statements to police, in which she claimed that the collision was an accident and that she had only intended to corner David to talk to him, not to harm him. The trial of Clara Harris began in February 2003 in a Houston courtroom packed with media representatives and curious onlookers, the case having generated enormous publicity due to its elements of wealth, infidelity, and the sheer dramatic horror of the crime itself. Prosecutors, led by Assistant District Attorney Mia Magnus, argued forcefully that Clara had acted with deliberate intent, pointing to the mechanics of the crime as evidence of premeditation. They highlighted the fact that Clara had accelerated, reversed, and accelerated again, a sequence of actions that demonstrated a conscious decision to use her vehicle as a weapon. They also introduced evidence of Clara's obsessive tracking of David, her purchase of the tracking device, and her statements to friends expressing a desire to make David pay for his betrayal. The defense, led by prominent attorney George Parnham, who had previously represented Andrea Yates, painted a starkly different picture, arguing that Clara was a woman in the throes of an acute emotional breakdown, suffering from what was described as a dissociative state triggered by the sight of her husband with his lover. They contended that she had not formed the specific intent to kill David and that the collision, while horrific, was the result of a momentary and complete loss of emotional control rather than a calculated act of murder. The jury, after hearing weeks of testimony and reviewing the forensic evidence, deliberated for several hours before rejecting the defense's narrative, finding Clara Harris guilty of murder. The judge sentenced her to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving half of her sentence. The case sent shockwaves through the Houston community and beyond, sparking intense discussions about the psychology of betrayal, the destructive power of jealousy, and the fine line between crimes of passion and premeditated murder. Clara Harris was incarcerated in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice System, where she remained until she was granted parole in 2023 after serving approximately half of her sentence, a decision that David's family vehemently opposed. The devastating aftermath of Clara's actions extended far beyond the prison walls, leaving David's children without a father, Lindsay Harris traumatized by having witnessed the murder from inside the vehicle, and a community forced to confront the terrifying reality that even the most accomplished and outwardly composed individuals are capable of committing acts of devastating violence when consumed by the green-eyed monster of jealousy. Number 3, Jean Harris, a lethal prescription for heartbreak. Jean Melville Harris was a highly educated, refined, and ostensibly proper woman who spent decades as the headmistress of the prestigious Madeira School, an elite all-girls boarding school in McLean, Virginia, a position that afforded her a life of intellectual stimulation, social respectability, and financial security. Born in 1923 in Cleveland, Ohio, Jean was the daughter of a struggling engineer and a mother who suffered from chronic illness, a background that instilled in her a fierce drive to achieve respectability and stability through education and professional accomplishment. She earned a degree from Smith College and a master's degree from New York University, building a career in education that placed her at the center of privileged East Coast society. In the mid-1960s, when Jean was in her early 40s, she met Herman Tarnower, a prominent cardiologist best known as the author of the wildly popular Scarsdale Diet, a high-protein, low-carbohydrate weight loss plan that had made him a household name and a wealthy man. Their relationship, which began as a doctor-patient interaction when Jean sought treatment for a minor ailment, evolved into a romantic involvement that would define the next 14 years of her life, ultimately leading her down a path of profound emotional degradation and, finally, to murder. From the outset, the relationship was deeply asymmetrical. Tarnower was a bachelor who enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, socializing with celebrities and wealthy clients, and he had no intention of marrying Jean or any other woman. He was, by all accounts, self-absorbed, emotionally distant, and chronically unfaithful, maintaining simultaneous relationships with multiple women, including a young divorcee named Lynn Triforos, who eventually moved into Tarnower's home in Purchase, New York, as his live-in companion. Jean, despite her intelligence and professional accomplishments, became hopelessly and pathologically devoted to Tarnower, subordinating every aspect of her life to his whims and schedule. She managed his correspondence, organized his parties, accompanied him to social functions, and tolerated his serial infidelities with a quiet desperation that baffled her friends and colleagues. Over the years, Tarnower's treatment of Jean became increasingly dismissive and cruel. He would cancel plans at the last minute, refuse to take her calls for weeks, and openly flaunt his relationship with Lynn Triforos, subjecting Jean to the kind of sustained psychological torment that eroded her self-esteem and sense of self-worth to the very foundation. Jean's friends noticed a marked change in her demeanor over the years. The once vibrant and articulate headmistress became anxious, depressed, and perpetually fixated on Tarnower's behavior, her entire emotional existence tethered to a man who treated her with casual indifference at best and active contempt at worst. She made several attempts to end the relationship, even moving to a new job in Phoenix, Arizona, for a brief period, but she always returned, drawn back by an obsessive attachment that had long since transcended love and entered the territory of psychological dependency. The situation deteriorated further in 1979 when Tarnower, in a particularly callous gesture, gave Jean a book entitled How to Live with a Neurotic Dog, a passive-aggressive commentary on what he perceived as her emotional neediness. By early 1980, Jean was in a state of profound psychological crisis. She was drinking heavily, taking prescription sedatives and antidepressants, and suffering from insomnia and weight loss. She had also been prescribed a powerful antidepressant called desipramine, which, in combination with alcohol and her deteriorating mental state, may have further destabilized her already fragile emotional condition. On the evening of March 10, 1980, Jean drove from her home in Virginia to Tarnower's house in Purchase, a journey of several hours through the cold March night. What precisely motivated her to make that drive remains a subject of psychological and legal debate, but evidence suggested she had recently learned that Tarnower had made changes to his will that further diminished any expectations she might have harbored about her role in his life. She arrived at his home around 10:30 at night, letting herself in with a key he had given her years earlier. She found Tarnower in his bedroom, in bed, watching television. What transpired in the next few minutes ended one life and destroyed another. According to Jean's account, she confronted Tarnower about his treatment of her and his relationship with Lynn Triforos, demanding that he choose between them. An argument ensued, during which Tarnower, characteristically dismissive, told Jean to leave. What happened next occurred with terrifying speed. Jean pulled a .32 caliber revolver from her purse and began firing. She shot Tarnower 4 times, with the bullet striking his chest, abdomen, and hand. Tarnower stumbled from the bedroom and collapsed in the hallway, where he bled to death within minutes. During the chaos, Jean was also shot in the leg, a wound that she claimed was inflicted when Tarnower grabbed the gun during their struggle, though forensic evidence suggested it was more consistent with a self-inflicted injury. Lynn Triforos, who was in the house at the time, heard the gunshots and called 911. When police arrived, they found Tarnower's body in the hallway and Jean sitting in the bedroom, dazed and bleeding. She was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The trial of Jean Harris, which began in late 1980 in White Plains, New York, was one of the most sensational legal proceedings of its era, a case that seemed to encapsulate the anxieties and contradictions facing professional women in late 20th century America. Prosecutors, led by District Attorney Carl Vergari, presented a straightforward case. Jean Harris had driven hundreds of miles with a loaded gun, entered Tarnower's home, and shot him in a calculated act of vengeance fueled by jealousy and a sense of entitlement. They highlighted the fact that she had purchased the gun weeks earlier, had brought it with her to Tarnower's house, and had fired multiple shots, none of which, they argued, were consistent with an accidental discharge or a momentary loss of control. The defense, led by attorney Joel Ornu, painted a far more sympathetic portrait, arguing that Jean was a battered woman in the emotional, if not physical, sense, a woman who had been subjected to years of psychological abuse that had driven her to a state of diminished capacity at the time of the shooting. They brought in prominent psychiatric experts, including Dr. Bernard Diamond, who testified that Jean was suffering from depression, acute situational stress, and the effects of desipramine intoxication, and that she had not formed the conscious intent to kill Tarnower but had instead acted in a dissociative fugue state. The jury, after an exhaustive trial that lasted weeks and featured testimony from a parade of socialites, educators, and medical experts, found Jean Harris guilty of second-degree murder in February 1981. The judge, despite hearing impassioned pleas for leniency from a long list of prominent character witnesses, including former students and colleagues who attested to Jean's lifetime of professional dedication and personal kindness, sentenced her to the maximum penalty of 15 years to life in prison. The verdict and sentence sparked a firestorm of controversy, with many prominent feminists and social commentators arguing that Jean had been punished for failing to conform to the passive, long-suffering stereotype of the woman scorned, while others maintained that the jury had correctly held her accountable for a premeditated act of murder. Jean Harris served 11 years of her sentence at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, where she distinguished herself by establishing literacy programs for fellow inmates and writing a critically acclaimed memoir. She was granted clemency by New York Governor Mario Cuomo in 1992, a decision that was met with mixed reactions but that allowed her to spend her final years in freedom. She died in 2012 at the age of 89, having never expressed explicit remorse for killing Herman Tarnower, a man whose cruel and manipulative treatment of her had ignited a jealousy so consuming that it obliterated her reason, her career, and the carefully constructed respectability of a lifetime, leaving behind a legacy that continues to provoke debate about the intersection of gender, power, psychological abuse, and the terrifying capacity of the human heart to exact a fatal toll when pushed beyond its limits. Number 4, Carolyn Warmus, The Fatal Price of Obsession. Carolyn Warmus was a young, attractive, and ambitious elementary school teacher in Greenburgh, New York, a suburb of Westchester County, whose outwardly normal life concealed a dark and dangerous obsession that would ultimately culminate in one of the most notorious crimes of passion in New York history. Born in 1964, Carolyn grew up in a comfortable middle-class home in Michigan, the daughter of a successful insurance executive, and by all accounts had a relatively unremarkable childhood and adolescence. She attended the University of Michigan, where she was known as a bright and sociable student, before moving to New York to pursue a career in education. In 1987, she took a job teaching at the Greenville Elementary School in Greenburgh, where she met Paul Solomon, a fellow teacher who was married to a woman named Betty Jean Solomon. Paul was handsome, charismatic, and unhappily married, a combination that proved irresistibly magnetic to Carolyn, who was 23 years old at the time they began their affair. What began as a seemingly casual workplace romance quickly escalated into an all-consuming obsession for Carolyn, who became utterly fixated on Paul to the exclusion of all else in her life. She began showering him with expensive gifts, including a Rolex watch and a custom-made leather jacket, and demanded increasing amounts of his time and attention. Paul, for his part, enjoyed the flattery and excitement of the affair but repeatedly told Carolyn that he was not going to leave his wife, a statement that Carolyn either did not believe or simply refused to accept. As the affair continued over the course of nearly 2 years, Carolyn's behavior became increasingly erratic and possessive. She would call Paul at all hours of the night, show up unannounced at his home, and engage in screaming arguments with him in public. She reportedly told friends that she loved Paul more than anyone had ever loved anyone and that she could not live without him, sentiments that, in retrospect, were not expressions of romantic devotion but rather warning signs of a deeply disturbed and dangerous psychological state. Betty Jean Solomon, Paul's wife, was aware of the affair and had confronted both Paul and Carolyn on multiple occasions. She and Paul had a young daughter together, and Betty Jean was determined to save her marriage, even as Paul continued to vacillate between his commitment to his family and his entanglement with Carolyn. The situation reached a boiling point in January 1989 when Betty Jean discovered a cache of love letters and photographs that Carolyn had sent to Paul, evidence of the affair that confirmed her worst fears. Betty Jean confronted Paul with the evidence and delivered an ultimatum: he had to end the affair immediately and completely, or she would file for divorce and seek full custody of their daughter. Paul, apparently recognizing the stakes, agreed to break things off with Carolyn, a decision that would prove fatal. On the evening of January 13, 1989, Betty Jean Solomon was alone in the Solomon home in Greenburgh when an intruder entered the house. The intruder, wearing dark clothing and gloves, confronted Betty Jean in the kitchen, and a violent struggle ensued. Betty Jean was shot 9 times at close range with a silenced .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol, a weapon that had been specifically chosen to muffle the sound of the gunfire and avoid alerting the neighbors. She was found dead on the kitchen floor the next morning by Paul, who had spent the night at Carolyn Warmus's apartment, a fact that initially made him a suspect in the investigation. The Greenburgh Police Department, led by detectives from the Major Crimes Unit, launched an exhaustive investigation into Betty Jean's murder. The crime scene yielded critical forensic evidence, including the discarded silencer, which was recovered from a storm drain near the Solomon home, and a footprint found on a door that had been kicked open to gain entry. Paul Solomon was interrogated and provided an ironclad alibi, placing him at Carolyn's apartment at the time of the murder, which shifted the focus of the investigation squarely onto Carolyn Warmus. Detectives quickly uncovered the details of the affair and Carolyn's obsessive behavior, establishing a clear motive. The breakthrough in the case came through a combination of forensic analysis and determined detective work. The silencer recovered from the storm drain was traced through a complex chain of evidence to a man named Vincent Parco, a private investigator and self-described arms dealer who had been hired by Carolyn Warmus months before the murder. Parco, who was later convicted for his role in the crime, had procured the murder weapon and constructed the silencer at Carolyn's request. Further investigation revealed that Carolyn had paid Parco thousands of dollars in cash, money that she had withdrawn from her bank account in the weeks leading up to the murder. Phone records placed Carolyn in the vicinity of the Solomon home on the night of the killing, contradicting her initial claims that she had been at her apartment all evening. Carolyn Warmus was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in April 1990, more than a year after the murder. Her trial began in early 1992 in White Plains, New York, and it was a spectacle that drew comparisons to the case of Jodi Arias, another Westchester County woman driven to murder by jealousy. Prosecutors, led by Assistant District Attorney James McCarty, presented a devastating case built on a foundation of forensic evidence, financial records, and testimony from Vincent Parco, who agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for a reduced sentence. They argued that Carolyn had meticulously planned the murder over a period of months, procuring the weapon, the silencer, and a pair of gloves through Parco, and conducting surveillance on the Solomon home to determine the best time to strike. The defense, led by attorney David Lewis, attempted to portray Carolyn as a scapegoat, arguing that the evidence against her was circumstantial and that Vincent Parco, a notorious criminal, had fabricated his testimony to save himself. They also suggested that Paul Solomon might have been involved in the murder, a theory that the jury found unpersuasive given his airtight alibi. The jury deliberated for 8 days before finding Carolyn Warmus guilty of second-degree murder in May 1992, and the judge sentenced her to 25 years to life in prison. The case did not end there, however, as Carolyn's legal team filed numerous appeals, arguing that prosecutorial misconduct and newly discovered evidence warranted a new trial. In 1999, an appeals court granted Carolyn a new trial based on the prosecution's failure to disclose certain evidence to the defense, but she was convicted again at the second trial in 2004, receiving the same sentence of 25 years to life. Carolyn Warmus remains incarcerated at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility in New York, having been denied parole multiple times, with parole boards consistently citing the calculated and premeditated nature of the crime. The case of Carolyn Warmus is a chilling study in the psychology of obsessive love, a reminder that jealousy, when it takes root in a disordered mind, can mutate from a painful emotion into a cold and deliberate instrument of murder, destroying not only the life of the intended victim but also the life of the perpetrator, the family left behind, and the sense of safety and security of an entire community. Number 5, Jodi Arias, a portrait of lethal obsession painted in blood. Jodi Arias is perhaps one of the most recognizable names in the annals of American true crime, a woman whose deeply disturbed psyche, compulsive lying, and consuming jealousy produced one of the most brutal and extensively documented murders of the 21st century. Born in 1980 in Salinas, California, Jodi grew up in a turbulent household and dropped out of high school before eventually earning a GED. She drifted through her early adulthood, working a series of low-paying jobs, including as a waitress and a photographer, and moved frequently, never establishing roots or long-term relationships. By her own admission and the testimony of those who knew her, Jodi was a skilled and habitual manipulator who crafted elaborate personae to attract and control the men in her life, presenting herself as sweet, compliant, and sexually adventurous while concealing a volatile and vindictive nature beneath the surface. In September 2006, at a prepaid legal services conference in Las Vegas, Nevada, Jodi met Travis Victor Alexander, a 29-year-old motivational speaker and salesman who was also a devout Mormon. Travis was handsome, charismatic, and deeply committed to his faith, and he initially resisted Jodi's aggressive pursuit of him. However, Jodi, who had decided almost immediately that Travis was the man she was going to marry, systematically infiltrated his life, converting to the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in a calculated move to gain acceptance from Travis and his social circle. Within weeks, they began dating, and what followed was an intense, secretive, and deeply dysfunctional relationship that lasted approximately 18 months. Travis was conflicted about the relationship from the beginning, as Jodi did not fit the mold of the woman he believed he should marry according to his religious beliefs, and his friends and family largely disliked and distrusted her, sensing a manipulative quality that they found deeply unsettling. Despite these reservations, Travis was drawn to Jodi's intense sexual availability, and the two engaged in a passionate physical relationship that Travis, bound by the strict moral code of his faith, experienced as simultaneously intoxicating and deeply shameful. Jodi, in contrast, experienced the relationship as an all-or-nothing proposition, and when Travis attempted to pull back, set boundaries, or express interest in other women, her jealousy erupted with terrifying ferocity. She hacked into his email accounts and social media profiles, slashed his tires, showed up unannounced at his home, and once crept into his house through an unlocked doggy door to crawl into bed with him while he slept. Travis, increasingly frightened by her behavior, finally ended the relationship for good in the spring of 2008, telling friends that Jodi was dangerous and that he feared what she might do. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Jodi's behavior became even more erratic and alarming. She sold most of her possessions, moved from her home in Palm Desert, California, to Yreka, in Northern California, near her grandparents' home, and borrowed a car from a friend, a move that investigators later argued was part of her effort to create a false trail and distance herself from the crime she was planning. On June 2, 2008, Jodi drove from Northern California to Mesa, Arizona, a journey of approximately 1,000 miles, arriving at Travis Alexander's home in the early morning hours of June 4. She had carefully planned her visit to avoid detection, turning off her cell phone, renting a car under a false name, and even dyeing her hair from blonde to brown in the days before the trip, details that would later form the backbone of the prosecution's premeditation argument. What happened inside Travis's home on that fateful morning was a bloodbath of almost incomprehensible savagery. Travis was in his bedroom when Jodi attacked him, and the evidence recovered at the scene told a story of extreme violence and struggle. Travis suffered 27 stab wounds, a slashed throat that came within millimeters of severing his carotid artery, and a single gunshot wound to the head. The sequence of injuries, determined by forensic pathologists, suggested that Travis was shot first, likely in the bathroom, before staggering into the hallway and then back into the bathroom, where he was repeatedly stabbed and his throat was cut. The sheer number and severity of the wounds indicated a level of rage and fury that went far beyond what was necessary to cause death, pointing instead to an attack driven by a deep, pathological hatred and a desire to inflict maximum pain and degradation. After killing Travis, Jodi dragged his body back into the shower of his master bathroom, a gruesome act that investigators interpreted as an attempt to clean the scene or, more disturbingly, a final act of dominance and humiliation. She then methodically cleaned the bathroom, deleted photographs from the digital camera that she and Travis had used to take explicit photos of each other just hours before the murder, and attempted to run the washing machine to destroy evidence. Unbeknownst to her, the camera's memory card retained the deleted images, including time-stamped photographs of Travis alive and naked in the shower, followed minutes later by an accidental photograph of Jodi's bloody foot and a dragging motion on the bathroom floor, a catastrophic error that would later provide the prosecution with irrefutable evidence of her presence at the scene and the timeline of the murder. Jodi then fled the scene in her rented car, driving through the Arizona desert and eventually arriving in Utah, where she was seen laughing and flirting with a male acquaintance at a restaurant just hours after the murder, a display of callousness that shocked the jury and the public when it was revealed at trial. Travis Alexander's body was discovered on June 9, 2008, by friends who had grown concerned when they were unable to reach him for several days. The Mesa Police Department responded to the scene and were immediately confronted with the horrific aftermath of the attack. The master bathroom was covered in blood, and Travis's decomposing body was in the shower stall. Detectives quickly identified Jodi Arias as a person of interest due to her known history with the victim, and when they contacted her, she provided a series of demonstrably false alibis, first claiming she had not been in Arizona at the time of the murder, then claiming she had been in Arizona but had left Travis alive and unharmed. Her lies unraveled quickly as forensic evidence mounted, including the discovery of her DNA mixed with Travis's blood at the scene, the time-stamped photographs on the recovered camera, and records placing her rented car in the vicinity of his home. Jodi Arias was arrested at her grandparents' home in Yreka, California, on July 15, 2008, and charged with first-degree murder. The trial of Jodi Arias, which began in January 2013 at the Maricopa County Superior Court in Phoenix, Arizona, was a media spectacle of unprecedented proportions, broadcast live on television and streamed by millions of viewers worldwide. Prosecutors, led by Juan Martinez, presented a methodical and devastating case, arguing that Jodi had meticulously planned the murder in a calculated act of premeditated vengeance after Travis rejected her. They walked the jury through the evidence of her premeditation, including the altered appearance, the disabled cell phone, the borrowed car, the gas cans she used to avoid leaving a paper trail at gas stations, and the sheer brutality of the attack itself. Jodi's defense team, facing an overwhelming mountain of forensic evidence, opted for a strategy that was as audacious as it was ultimately unsuccessful, arguing that Jodi had killed Travis in self-defense after he attacked her in a fit of rage upon dropping his camera in the shower. They claimed that Travis had a secret history of physical and sexual abuse and that Jodi suffered from battered woman syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder, assertions that were aggressively dismantled by the prosecution, which called a parade of Jodi's own friends and acquaintances to testify that she had never mentioned any abuse by Travis and that she had stalked and harassed him relentlessly. Jodi herself took the stand for an astonishing 18 days of testimony, during which she spun an elaborate, ever-shifting narrative that the jury found to be riddled with lies, inconsistencies, and outright fabrications. The jury deliberated for approximately 15 hours before finding Jodi Arias guilty of first-degree murder on May 8, 2013. The penalty phase of the trial, however, proved far more complicated, as the jury deadlocked on whether to impose the death penalty, a result that triggered multiple retrials of the penalty phase over the following years. It was not until April 2020, after years of legal maneuvering and failed attempts to secure a death sentence, that Maricopa County Superior Court Judge Sherry Stevens formally sentenced Jodi Arias to life in prison without the possibility of parole, bringing a definitive, if anticlimactic, end to one of the most closely watched criminal cases in American history. Jodi Arias is currently serving her sentence at the Arizona State Prison Complex in Perryville, where she will remain until her death. The case of Jodi Arias stands as a stark and terrifying testament to the destructive power of pathological jealousy, a case in which a manipulative and deeply disordered individual, unable to accept rejection, channeled her rage into an act of violence so extreme and so savage that it defied comprehension, leaving behind a devastated family, a traumatized community, and a permanent scar on the public consciousness. Number 6, Drew Peterson, a pattern of jealousy sealed in a bathtub. Drew Walter Peterson is a former Bolingbrook, Illinois, police sergeant whose name became synonymous with the dark side of law enforcement after the suspicious deaths of 2 of his 4 wives and the baffling disappearance of his 3rd wife transformed him into a national symbol of domestic terror. Born in 1954, Peterson joined the Bolingbrook Police Department in 1977 and served for nearly 30 years, building a reputation as a brash, confident, and controlling officer who was well versed in the mechanics of criminal investigations and the vulnerabilities of the justice system. His first marriage, to Carol Brown, ended in divorce in 1980, a relatively uneventful dissolution that produced no public scandal. His second marriage, to Kathleen Savio, a nurse and the mother of 2 of his sons, was far more turbulent and would eventually end in the mysterious and suspicious circumstances that laid the groundwork for his eventual downfall. Peterson married Kathleen in 1992, and from the beginning, the relationship was characterized by Drew's controlling behavior, financial manipulation, and emotional abuse, dynamics that Kathleen documented in letters and conversations with friends and family long before her death. The couple divorced in 2003, and as part of the settlement, Kathleen was awarded the family home in Bolingbrook in custody of their 2 sons. Drew, who was consumed by a jealous rage over the divorce and Kathleen's newfound independence, did not take the dissolution of the marriage well, repeatedly harassing her, showing up at her home uninvited, and making threatening comments that she reported to friends and, on at least one occasion, to the police. On March 1, 2004, Kathleen Savio was found dead in the bathtub of her Bolingbrook home by a neighbor who had come to check on her after she failed to show up for a family gathering. The initial investigation into her death was conducted by the Bolingbrook Police Department, Drew Peterson's own department, a conflict of interest of staggering proportions that would later prove catastrophic. The responding officers, at least one of whom was a close friend of Drew's, concluded almost immediately that Kathleen's death was an accidental drowning, despite the presence of several deeply suspicious physical indicators at the scene. Kathleen's body was found face up in a dry bathtub, her hair soaked in blood from a deep gash on the back of her scalp, and a small amount of water in the tub. The official autopsy, performed by the Will County Coroner's Office, listed the cause of death as accidental drowning, a conclusion that Kathleen's family vehemently disputed from the very beginning, arguing that Kathleen was an excellent swimmer who would not have drowned in a few inches of water and that the head wound was consistent with an assault, not a fall. Despite their protests, no further investigation was conducted, and Drew Peterson, who had been the last person to see Kathleen alive and who stood to benefit financially from her death through a life insurance policy and the elimination of his divorce obligations, was never considered a suspect. Drew Peterson moved on quickly, marrying his fourth wife, Stacy Ann Callis, in 2004, just months after Kathleen's death. Stacy was 20 years younger than Drew, a vivacious and outgoing woman who seemed, at first, to be a willing participant in the life Peterson had constructed. However, as the years passed, the same patterns of control, jealousy, and emotional abuse that had characterized his marriage to Kathleen began to emerge in his relationship with Stacy. Drew monitored her phone calls, dictated what she could wear and who she could see, and became enraged by any perceived infidelity or independence. Stacy, who had 2 young children with Drew, became increasingly isolated and frightened, confiding in friends and family members that Drew had told her he could kill her and make it look like an accident, a chilling statement that carried a horrific weight given the circumstances of Kathleen Savio's death. On October 28, 2007, Stacy Peterson vanished from the Bolingbrook home she shared with Drew. Drew claimed that Stacy had left the house in the middle of the night to meet a man and had simply never returned, a story that her family and friends found entirely unbelievable, noting that Stacy would never have abandoned her 2 young children. The disappearance of Stacy Peterson triggered a massive media firestorm and, critically, prompted law enforcement authorities outside of Bolingbrook to take a fresh look at the death of Kathleen Savio. The Illinois State Police, now leading the investigation into Stacy's disappearance, exhumed Kathleen's body in November 2007 and ordered a new autopsy, conducted by renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden. Dr. Baden's findings were stark and unequivocal. Kathleen Savio had not drowned accidentally but had been the victim of a homicide, her death caused by an assault in which she was held down in the bathtub and drowned, the gash on her scalp consistent with being struck by a blunt object. Based on Dr. Baden's testimony and a mountain of circumstantial evidence gathered during the investigation into Stacy's disappearance, Drew Peterson was arrested and charged with the murder of Kathleen Savio in May 2009. Stacy Peterson was never found, and although Drew was the sole suspect in her presumed murder, the lack of a body made prosecution for that crime legally unfeasible at the time. The trial of Drew Peterson for the murder of Kathleen Savio began in July 2012 in Joliet, Illinois, and it was a case that hinged almost entirely on circumstantial evidence and the testimony of hearsay witnesses, a legal strategy made possible by a controversial Illinois law passed in the wake of Stacy's disappearance that allowed prosecutors to introduce statements from alleged victims of domestic violence who were unavailable to testify. Under this law, known informally as Drew's Law, the prosecution was permitted to present testimony from friends and family members of both Kathleen and Stacy, who recounted statements the 2 women had made about Drew's abusive, controlling, and threatening behavior, including Stacy's statement to a pastor that Drew had killed Kathleen and that she feared he would kill her too. The prosecution also presented evidence of Drew's motive, focusing on his jealousy over Kathleen's post-divorce life, his financial gain from her death, and his history of controlling and abusive behavior toward women. The defense argued that the prosecution's case was entirely circumstantial and that there was no direct evidence linking Drew to Kathleen's death, pointing to the botched initial investigation as the real source of the injustice. The jury, after deliberating for approximately 14 hours, found Drew Peterson guilty of first-degree murder in September 2012, and the judge sentenced him to 38 years in prison. While the conviction brought a measure of justice for Kathleen Savio, it provided no answers for the family of Stacy Peterson, who remains missing to this day and is presumed dead. Drew Peterson is currently incarcerated in a federal prison, serving an additional 40-year sentence for a separate conviction for plotting to hire a hitman to kill the prosecutor who convicted him for Kathleen's murder. The case of Drew Peterson is a harrowing illustration of how jealousy, when combined with a deep knowledge of law enforcement procedures and a position of authority, can be weaponized to commit murder with near impunity, a pattern of predatory behavior that destroyed multiple lives and shattered the trust of an entire community and those sworn to protect it. Number 7. Rudolph Infante, a final act of possessive rage. Rudolph Infante was a man whose inability to accept the end of his marriage manifested in a wave of violence so sudden and so absolute that it left an indelible scar on the West Palm Beach, Florida, community and forever altered the lives of everyone connected to the tragedy. Born in 1958, Rudy Infante, as he was known to friends and family, was a Cuban-American man who had spent much of his adult life working as a mechanic and handyman in the Palm Beach County area, a solid, unremarkable existence that belied the depth of his emotional volatility and the dangerous intensity of his possessiveness. He married his wife, whose identity has been protected in many public records due to the nature of the crime and the surviving family members, in the early 1980s, and for a time, the marriage appeared to function within the normal bounds of a working-class household, producing children and establishing a shared life in a modest West Palm Beach neighborhood. However, beneath the surface, the marriage was deeply troubled, plagued by Rudy's controlling behavior, simmering jealousy, and a tendency toward verbal aggression that gradually eroded the emotional foundation of the relationship. Rudy's jealousy was not confined to abstract suspicion but was directed at specific individuals, particularly any man who showed the slightest interest in his wife or whom he perceived as a threat to his marriage. As the years passed, the marriage deteriorated to the point of irreparability, and Rudy's wife, exhausted by his constant accusations and emotional abuse, made the difficult decision to end the relationship. She filed for divorce, a legal act that Rudy interpreted not as the legitimate termination of a failed marriage but as a profound personal betrayal, an act of rebellion that triggered a cascade of rage and resentment that would build over the following months until it exploded into violence. The divorce proceedings were acrimonious, with Rudy contesting virtually every aspect of the settlement, from the division of property to the terms of custody, using the legal system as an instrument of continued control and harassment. During this period, Rudy's behavior became increasingly erratic and threatening. He made repeated threats against his estranged wife, vowing that she would never be happy with another man and that he would rather see her dead than watch her move on. He stalked her, driving by her new residence and her workplace, and made menacing phone calls that left her in a state of chronic fear. She sought restraining orders and reported his behavior to the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office, but the interventions of the legal system proved inadequate to protect her from a man who was determined to exact a final, irreversible price for her perceived disloyalty. In the fall of 1995, Rudy's estranged wife began a new relationship with a man she had met after the separation, a development that Rudy discovered through his persistent surveillance of her life. The knowledge that she was seeing another man was the catalyst that transformed his simmering jealousy into a cold and deliberate plan for murder. Rudy began stalking not only his wife but also her new boyfriend, learning their routines, their schedules, and the locations they frequented. He armed himself with a handgun and began lying in wait, his actions no longer driven by impulsive anger but by a calculated determination to eliminate both of the people he held responsible for the destruction of his marriage. On the evening of October 14, 1995, Rudy's estranged wife and her boyfriend arrived at a residence in West Palm Beach, a location they believed to be private and secure. Rudy had followed them to the location, having tracked their movements throughout the evening. He parked a short distance away and approached the residence on foot, carrying the loaded handgun. What happened next was brief, brutal, and decisive. Rudy forced his way into the residence or intercepted the couple as they were entering, and without warning or negotiation, he opened fire, shooting both his estranged wife and her boyfriend multiple times at close range. The sheer ferocity of the attack left no doubt about his intent. This was not a crime of momentary passion or a struggle that had escalated out of control but a targeted execution driven by a jealous fury that had been fermenting for months. Both victims died at the scene from multiple gunshot wounds. After the shooting, Jodi Infante fled the scene, triggering a massive manhunt by the Palm Beach County Sheriff's Office and local law enforcement agencies. Detectives quickly identified Jodi as the primary suspect based on the well-documented history of threats and stalking, and a warrant was issued for his arrest. Jodi remained at large for a brief period, but the net closed quickly, and he was apprehended by law enforcement officers without incident a short time after the murders. He was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the case moved swiftly through the legal system, the evidence against him overwhelming and incontrovertible. The trial of Rudolph Infante took place in 1997 in a West Palm Beach courtroom, and while the facts of the case were largely uncontested, the proceedings focused on the degree of premeditation and the appropriate penalty. Prosecutors presented a devastating case that centered on the months of stalking, the explicit threats Jodi had made against his estranged wife, and the calculated nature of the ambush, arguing that the murders were the culmination of a deliberate plan formed in a crucible of jealous rage. They introduced testimony from friends, family members, and law enforcement officers who documented the escalating pattern of threatening behavior, painting a portrait of a man who had been walking a path toward murder for months and who had chosen to carry out his threat with cold precision. The defense, acknowledging the gravity of the evidence, attempted to mitigate the severity of the charges by arguing that Jodi had been under extreme emotional distress due to the collapse of his marriage and that his actions, while horrific, were the product of a temporary psychological break rather than a coldly calculated plan. The jury rejected this argument, finding Rudolph Infante guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, a verdict that reflected their determination that the killings were premeditated and deliberate. The judge, citing the extreme brutality of the crimes, the clear evidence of planning, and the lack of any meaningful remorse, sentenced Jodi Infante to death, making him one of the many inmates on Florida's death row. The case of Rudolph Infante is a grim and powerful reminder of the lethal potential of jealous obsession, a demonstration of how a single individual's inability to accept the end of a relationship can escalate from threats and stalking into an act of devastating violence that extinguishes 2 lives and leaves a permanent wound in the fabric of a community, serving as a stark illustration of the catastrophic consequences that can unfold when jealousy is allowed to fester unchecked until it metastasizes into murder. Number 8. Kirsten Lund, a deadly confrontation with a rival. Kirsten Lund was a woman living in St. Paul, Minnesota, whose deep-seated jealousy over her husband's extramarital affair drove her to orchestrate and carry out one of the most cold-blooded and calculated murders in the state's recent history, a crime that shocked the community with its sheer ruthlessness and the devastating collateral damage it inflicted. Kirsten, who was in her early 30s at the time of the crime, was married to a man who, by all accounts, was a loving but flawed partner, a man who had strayed from the marriage and become entangled in a relationship with another woman, a relationship that resulted in the other woman becoming pregnant. The discovery of the affair and the pregnancy was a body blow to Kirsten, triggering a psychological response that was not characterized by grief or sadness but by a white-hot, all-consuming jealousy that rapidly overwhelmed her capacity for reason and moral judgment. While many individuals in similar circumstances might seek a divorce, confront the unfaithful spouse, or turn to therapy to process their pain, Kirsten's response was fundamentally different. She became fixated on the idea that the only way to reclaim her life and eliminate the source of her torment was to eliminate the other woman, a fixation that hardened over a period of weeks from a fleeting dark thought into an immutable and deliberate plan. Kirsten did not act impulsively or in the heat of a sudden confrontation. Instead, she demonstrated a chilling capacity for planning and deception that belied the emotional chaos she was experiencing internally. She began conducting surveillance on her husband's pregnant lover, learning her routines, her daily schedule, the places she frequented, and the times she was most vulnerable. She researched methods of murder, exploring various options before settling on a plan that she believed would allow her to carry out the killing without being immediately apprehended. She devised an elaborate ruse to lure the woman to a remote or isolated location, using a combination of false identities, pretexts, and manipulations that demonstrated a level of cunning that was deeply disturbing to the investigators who later unraveled the plot. On a cold day in 2002, Kirsten Lund put her plan into action. She contacted her husband's pregnant lover, using a pretense that was designed to allay any suspicion and ensure the woman's cooperation. The exact nature of the ruse has been somewhat obscured in public records to protect the identities of the families involved, but what is clear is that Kirsten successfully convinced the woman to meet her at a predetermined location in the St. Paul area, a location that had been chosen specifically because it was isolated and offered minimal risk of witnesses. When the woman arrived at the location, she was met not by a sympathetic confidant but by a woman consumed by a jealousy so absolute that it had stripped away every vestige of human empathy. Kirsten attacked the woman, who was visibly pregnant, with a ferocity and determination that left no room for mercy or second thoughts. The nature of the attack was violent and direct, resulting in the death of both the woman and her unborn child, a double homicide that elevated the moral gravity of the crime to an almost unfathomable level. After the murder, Kirsten attempted to cover her tracks, disposing of evidence and constructing an alibi that she hoped would shield her from suspicion. However, the investigation into the disappearance and death of the pregnant woman was thorough and relentless, led by the St. Paul Police Department's homicide unit in conjunction with Ramsey County investigators. Detectives quickly focused on Kirsten Lund as a person of interest due to her known motive, her relationship to the victim through her husband, and inconsistencies in her account of her movements on the day of the murder. The break in the case came through a combination of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and the painstaking reconstruction of Kirsten's movements and communications in the days leading up to the crime. Cell phone records placed her in the vicinity of the murder scene at the time of the killing, and forensic evidence recovered from the scene, including fibers, DNA, and other trace evidence, directly linked her to the victim. Faced with an overwhelming and irrefutable body of evidence, Kirsten Lund's carefully constructed alibi collapsed, and she was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, one for the death of the woman and one for the death of the unborn child. The trial of Kirsten Lund took place in a Ramsey County courtroom in 2003, and the proceedings were marked by the profound sadness and outrage that the community felt over the murder of a pregnant woman. Prosecutors presented a case that was devastating in its simplicity and completeness, arguing that Kirsten had meticulously planned and executed the murder of a pregnant rival out of pure, unadulterated jealousy, a motive that was both comprehensible in its human origins and horrifying in its extremity. They walked the jury through the weeks of surveillance, the elaborate ruse used to lure the victim, the violence of the attack, and the calculated attempts to destroy evidence, painting a portrait of a woman who had made a series of deliberate, conscious choices to take not one but 2 lives. The defense, constrained by the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, attempted to argue that Kirsten had been in a state of diminished capacity due to the emotional trauma of discovering her husband's infidelity and the impending birth of his child with another woman, a psychological defense that sought to reduce the charges from first degree to a lesser offense. The jury, after careful deliberation, rejected this argument, finding Kirsten Lund guilty of first-degree murder on both counts. The judge, acknowledging the extraordinary cruelty of killing a pregnant woman, sentenced Kirsten to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the maximum sentence available under Minnesota law, ensuring that she would spend the remainder of her natural life behind bars. The case of Kirsten Lund is a profoundly disturbing study in the dark extremities of human jealousy, a reminder that the emotion, when it takes root in a mind capable of sustained planning and deliberate deception, can produce acts of violence that extend far beyond the primary target, destroying the innocent, the unborn, and the very concept of human decency in a single, devastating act of vengeance. Number 9, James Keown, a poisoned marriage built on digital deception. James Keown was a man who presented himself to the world as a charismatic, ambitious, and technologically savvy professional, a persona that masked a deeply deceitful and ultimately murderous nature whose jealousy and financial desperation drove him to commit one of the most methodically planned domestic murders in Massachusetts history. Born in 1970, James grew up in the Midwest and attended college, where he developed a reputation as a smooth talker and a skilled manipulator, traits that would define his entire adult life. He met Julie Keown, a bright and compassionate woman who worked as a financial analyst, in the late 1990s, and the two married in 2000, settling initially in the Kansas City area before relocating to the Boston suburb of Waltham, Massachusetts, in 2003, a move prompted by James's acceptance of a position at a Boston-area radio station, or so he claimed. In reality, James Keown's professional life was a web of lies. He had fabricated much of his resume, exaggerated his accomplishments, and was chronically unable to hold down a job, a fact that he concealed from Julie through an elaborate scheme of deception that involved leaving the house each morning dressed for work and then spending the day at libraries, coffee shops, and other public places, maintaining the fiction of employment while their financial situation steadily deteriorated. Beneath the surface of their seemingly normal suburban life, the Keown marriage was under immense strain, and the cracks were beginning to show in ways that James found increasingly threatening to his carefully constructed facade. Julie, a financially literate woman, began to notice discrepancies in their bank accounts and credit card statements, discrepancies that suggested James was not earning the income he claimed and was, in fact, draining their savings through secret expenditures and failed ventures. As Julie began to ask questions and demand answers, James's response was not to come clean but to escalate his deceptions, a dynamic that introduced a toxic element of distrust and simmering resentment into the marriage. However, it was not merely financial stress that drove James Keown to murder, it was a toxic cocktail of jealousy, resentment, and a desperate need to maintain control over a life that was unraveling. James had learned, through his own investigative efforts, that Julie had been in contact with a former boyfriend, a revelation that ignited a jealous fury in him that was entirely disproportionate to any actual threat to the marriage. In James's disordered mind, Julie's contact with her past represented not just a potential infidelity but a fundamental rejection of him as a man, an existential humiliation that he could not tolerate. The combination of Julie's growing financial scrutiny and his own paranoid jealousy created a pressure cooker of resentment and fear in James's mind, and from this toxic brew emerged a plan for murder that was as coldly calculated as it was cowardly. James decided to kill Julie by poisoning her with ethylene glycol, the sweet-tasting, highly toxic chemical found in antifreeze, a method that he believed would mimic the symptoms of a natural illness and avoid detection by medical professionals. Over a period of several weeks in the summer of 2004, James began lacing Julie's beverages, primarily her Gatorade, with ethylene glycol, administering the poison in carefully measured doses that were designed to build up in her system gradually, producing a progressive and seemingly unexplained illness. Julie began experiencing a constellation of troubling symptoms, including nausea, dizziness, abdominal pain, and neurological disturbances, and she sought medical attention on multiple occasions. Doctors, presented with a young, otherwise healthy woman reporting vague and fluctuating symptoms, initially struggled to arrive at a diagnosis, running a battery of tests that failed to identify the true cause of her illness. James, who was present at many of her medical appointments, played the role of the concerned husband to perfection, a performance that was as calculated as the poisoning itself and that served to further delay a correct diagnosis by reassuring doctors that her symptoms were likely stress-related or the result of a minor viral infection. As the poisoning continued, Julie's condition deteriorated rapidly and catastrophically. The ethylene glycol was causing irreversible damage to her kidneys, liver, and brain, damage that would have been preventable if the true cause had been identified and treated with the appropriate antidote, fomepizole. By the time doctors at a Boston-area hospital finally recognized the signs of ethylene glycol poisoning and ordered the specific toxicology tests that would confirm the diagnosis, the damage to Julie's organs was too extensive to reverse. She slipped into a coma and died on September 8, 2004, surrounded by a family that was still struggling to understand how a healthy young woman could have been struck down so suddenly and inexplicably. The investigation into Julie Keown's death began almost immediately after her death was attributed to ethylene glycol poisoning, a finding that automatically transformed a tragic medical case into a homicide investigation. The Waltham Police Department, working in conjunction with the Massachusetts State Police and the Office of the Middlesex County District Attorney, launched a meticulous inquiry into the circumstances surrounding Julie's illness and death. Detectives quickly focused on James Keown as the primary suspect, recognizing that he was the person with the most access to Julie's food and beverages and the one who stood to benefit financially from her death through a life insurance policy. The investigation uncovered a trove of damning evidence, including James's internet search history, which revealed that he had conducted extensive online research into ethylene glycol poisoning, its symptoms, its detection in toxicology screens, and methods for administering it undetected, searches that were conducted in the weeks and months leading up to Julie's illness. Further investigation revealed the full extent of James's employment deception, his financial machinations, and his jealousy over Julie's contact with her former boyfriend, establishing a clear and compelling motive for murder. Forensic analysis of the Gatorade bottles and other containers in the Keown home confirmed the presence of ethylene glycol, providing the physical evidence that directly linked James to the poisoning. James Keown was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in 2005. His trial took place in 2006 in a Middlesex County courtroom, and the prosecution's case was a masterclass in the presentation of circumstantial evidence, weaving together the digital trail of internet searches, the financial deception, the motive of jealousy and financial gain, and the forensic evidence of the poison into an airtight narrative of premeditated murder. The defense attempted to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and that Julie's poisoning could have been accidental or the result of an unknown source of contamination, arguments that the jury found utterly unconvincing in the face of the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. The jury deliberated for a relatively short period before finding James Keown guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The case of James Keown is a chilling reminder of the potential for jealousy, when combined with financial desperation and a capacity for sustained deception, to produce a form of murder that is as slow and torturous as it is calculated, a poisoning that unfolded over weeks in the supposed safety of the victim's own home, a violation of the most fundamental bonds of trust and intimacy that underscores the terrifying reality that the greatest danger a person can face may be the one lying in wait beside them. Number 10, George Smith, a rampage of jealousy in the frozen north. George Smith was a man whose life in Anchorage, Alaska, ended in an explosion of violence so extreme and so comprehensive that it shocked even a state accustomed to the harsh realities of its frontier culture, a man whose jealous rage over his wife's suspected infidelity led him to commit a double murder that was as brutal as it was definitive. Born in the mid-20th century, George Smith was a lifelong Alaskan, a rugged and self-reliant individual who had spent much of his adult life working in the demanding industries that defined the state's economy, including construction, fishing, and resource extraction. He was known to his friends and acquaintances as a hard-working but emotionally intense man, a person who was quick to anger and who possessed a jealous streak that those close to him had learned to navigate with caution. George married his wife, a woman whose identity has been somewhat shielded in public records out of respect for the surviving family, in the 1980s, and for a time, the marriage functioned within the rough-hewn parameters of working-class Alaskan life, a partnership forged in the shared hardships and isolation of life in the far north. However, as the years passed, the marriage deteriorated, as marriages often do, under the cumulative weight of financial stress, emotional neglect, and the peculiar pressures of life in a state where long, dark winters and geographic isolation can amplify interpersonal tensions to unbearable levels. George's response to the deterioration of the marriage was characterized by an escalating pattern of jealousy, suspicion, and control that mirrored the behavior of many domestic abusers but that would eventually transcend the boundaries of emotional abuse and enter the realm of lethal violence. George became convinced, whether through actual evidence or the paranoid projections of his own insecurities, that his wife was having an affair with a specific individual, a man who was known to both of them and who, in George's mind, represented the ultimate humiliation and betrayal. George's jealousy was not a passive emotion but an active, consuming force that drove his behavior in the weeks and months leading up to the murders. He confronted his wife repeatedly with his accusations, interrogating her about her whereabouts, her phone calls, and her associations, and he reportedly made threats against both her and the man he suspected of being her lover, threats that were serious enough to cause concern among those who heard them but that, tragically, did not result in effective intervention by law enforcement or social services. The isolated nature of their Anchorage neighborhood and the cultural norm of non-interference in domestic disputes that persists in many parts of Alaska may have contributed to the failure to intervene before the situation reached its catastrophic conclusion. On a winter night in 1991, the pressure that had been building inside George Smith for months finally detonated. The exact sequence of events that led to the confrontation remains somewhat unclear, as there were no surviving witnesses to the initial stages of the attack, but the forensic evidence and the subsequent investigation painted a grim and unmistakable picture of a man who had crossed the point of no return. George, armed with a blunt instrument, possibly a hammer or a heavy tool commonly found in his line of work, attacked his wife in their Anchorage home, striking her repeatedly with a force that was far beyond what was necessary to subdue or incapacitate her. The attack was characterized by an overkill pattern, a forensic term that describes a level of violence exceeding what is required to cause death and that is typically associated with crimes driven by intense emotional rage. During the attack or immediately after it, the man whom George suspected of being his wife's lover arrived at the home either by coincidence or by prior arrangement, and George turned his fury on him as well, bludgeoning the second victim with the same ferocious intensity. Both victims died at the scene from massive blunt force trauma to the head and upper body, their injuries so severe that investigators described the crime scene as one of the most brutal they had encountered in their careers. After the murders, George Smith did not attempt to flee or conceal his actions in any sophisticated way. He remained at the scene or in the immediate vicinity, and when Anchorage Police Department officers arrived in response to a welfare check or a noise complaint, they found a scene of carnage that was immediately classified as a double homicide. George was apprehended at the scene, and while the initial hours of the investigation were consumed with securing the crime scene and documenting the extensive forensic evidence, the identity of the perpetrator was never in question. The investigation, led by the Anchorage Police Department's Homicide Unit, focused on establishing the motive and the sequence of events. Detectives recovered the murder weapon, which was covered in the blood of both victims, and forensic analysis of the blood spatter patterns, the positions of the bodies, and the state of the home confirmed that George had attacked his wife first and then turned on the second victim when he arrived. Interviews with friends, neighbors, and family members established the clear and unambiguous motive of jealous rage, with multiple witnesses recounting George's accusations, his threats, and his escalating pattern of controlling and abusive behavior in the weeks leading up to the murders. George Smith was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the case moved through the Alaska legal system with a speed that reflected the overwhelming nature of the evidence against him. The trial took place in an Anchorage courtroom in 1992, and the proceedings, while relatively straightforward from a legal standpoint, were emotionally grueling for all involved, as the details of the brutal bludgeoning were presented to the jury in forensic detail. Prosecutors argued that the murders were the direct and predictable result of George's jealous obsession, a rage that had been building for months and that had finally found its outlet in an act of extreme and indiscriminate violence. They emphasized the overkill nature of the attacks, arguing that the sheer number and severity of the blows demonstrated a level of emotional fury that precluded any claim of accident, self-defense, or diminished capacity. The defense, faced with the physical evidence of the crime scene and the testimony of multiple witnesses regarding George's threats and jealousy, mounted a limited challenge, arguing that George had been in a state of emotional disturbance at the time of the killings and that his capacity for rational thought had been compromised by the stress of the marital breakdown. The jury, after deliberating, found George Smith guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the judge, acknowledging the extreme brutality of the crimes and the clear evidence of premeditation and deliberate intent, sentenced him to 99 years in prison, a sentence that, given his age at the time, effectively ensured that he would die behind bars. The case of George Smith is a harrowing bookend to this compilation, a final, devastating illustration of the terrible toll that jealousy can exact when it is allowed to fester in isolation, without intervention, without accountability, and without the moderating influence of reason or empathy, a reminder that in the most extreme cases, the emotion does not merely destroy a relationship or a reputation but annihilates human life itself, leaving behind nothing but blood, grief, and the cold, irrevocable judgment of the law.